it's not a question of not having the natural resources. It's not a question of not having the funds to do it. But yeah, we just don't have the right leaders.
Hello, everyone. Today we're diving into a topic that challenges the narrative surrounding the African race. Joining me is Dr. Rolo. She's a scholar and an expert in international relations and decolonial studies. We explore the origins of the negative labels that are often pinned on African people, from slavery to poverty and even to corruption.
Have we risen above it? Of course. A lot of that does not make it much to media, but we are rising above it.
We discuss the origin of Pan-Africanism.
There was a recognition that we were going through an oppression, and that oppression was similar because of the color of our skin. For that reason, it was necessary for Black people to unite to fight this oppression.
The role of the African Union alongside the successes and criticisms of the African Union.
My answer to that is that if it went in the direction that Nkrumah was talking about, the OAU would have been a very powerful institution. But the organization was created exactly the way African leaders wanted it to be. A loose organization without much authority.
Also, Dr. Rulo offers some insights into a holistic approach for African economic integration.
There needs to be a single foreign policy that guides the way we interact with the West.
I hope you enjoy it. Almost instantly, once you mention the African race, the first thing that comes to mind is slavery. It is struggling, it is oppression, it is every negative thing you can think about that the race has actually faced over time. Some of them overcome, some maybe not overcome yet, but we are often presented in the light of our weakness. Why do you think that is so?
Okay. So I will start by saying that I am not an expert in every discourse on Black race in general, because that's a huge umbrella over people that are very heterogeneous. And by heterogeneous, I mean that, there are Africans and there are African Americans and there are Afro Caribbeans and, there are Afro Germans and all of that. So I cannot speak broadly about these people's experiences, but I can touch upon how maybe over time there has been some relationship across these groups. So
Absolutely.
why is it that it's been negative? And I'll speak from the perspective of slavery, and maybe later on, some of the scenes that we see today, even in the media. Um, have we
Right.
risen above it? Of course. Like even while the slave trade was going on, there are lots of accounts, and we can, find these from books. There is a book by Sylvanie Diouf, on the slave trade and how Africans either resisted passively or actively to it. And these are resources that account for how we have resisted. There is an agency to even the experience that we had as Black people. So we've been fighting, we have been trying to rise above it. You find African Americans, or just like, Africans, Afro Caribbeans across, doing great things in their specific fields, but also kind of like, coming together in other ways through entertainment or education, so
Right.
we are rising above it. A
Right.
lot of that does not make it much to media, but there are several instances that this group is rising and will continue to rise.
Right. I think I agree with you on the last point there totally, actually, that many of the things going on in the African continent, or even among the African race, they don't really make it to the media. A classic example of them, which we don't have to dive into that topic yet, or maybe at all, is the case of the war going on right now in Sudan. Every time I think about that war, the attention it's got from the media is almost nothing compared to the wars in the Middle East, or the war in the Middle East, the war between Israel and Hamas right now, or even Russia-Ukraine war. Compare that to the one going on in Africa, it's absolutely no media attention that is given to that. If anything at all, you get maybe 5 seconds of media attention in a month compared to the other two wars going on around the world. But let's not dive into that. Let me follow up on one of the things you mentioned there. Slavery has been before even the colonialist came to Africa.
Mhm.
Slavery has even been locally in Africa.
Mhm.
In fact, let me use some local words here. So I am from the southwestern part of Nigeria. I'm Yoruba tribe. One of the words that I find in the Yoruba language is the word Iwofa, and another one like it is the word Eru. The two of them actually they date prior to the colonialist in Nigeria. And I'm taking Nigeria now as a microcosm of what
Mhm.
goes on across the African race. Even before we were colonized, we traded in between ourselves. In fact, it was well known, right, that if you, for instance, if you were caught stealing, you're most likely going to be banished from the village and you will be
Mhm.
sent as a slave somewhere else. If you owed someone, you're most likely going to pay with your child prehistorically in the culture. But when you think about those kind of factors, maybe alongside of reality that you've studied in your area of expertise, what was the trait in the African race that made slave traders attracted to the African race at the time that they were attracted to us? And there were many of them, right? There was the Spanish, the Portuguese, and of course the British that came our way. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So I'll start off by saying that, if even the slave trade wasn't explicit to the continent, slave trade has, or slavery, has been part of human existence for the longest time. It did not just happen in Africa, it happened in Europe, it happened in other parts of the world, that people were engaged in the act of slaves or slave trading. So yes, like it was there before the colonizers came. It wasn't unusual when there were wars between groups or kingdoms that prisoners of war ultimately became slaves, or in other words, and or in other situations ended up in the military of the other kingdom. So those things were common across history. It was also common that when you were in debt, that a way to pay off that debt could be a form of
Right.
slavery.
Mhm.
So these things were already happening. They were happening in Africa. They were happening in other parts of the world. It's not explicit to the continent. However, the reason the transatlantic slave trade comes in and makes a difference is that the volume changes. These were like one or two people who were, sold into slave trade as a result of debt or as a result of war. And then the sub-Saharan slave trade came still, taking people in millions across the Sahara and into the Gulf. But the
Right.
volume of the transatlantic slave trade was much more, now taking millions over centuries across different parts of the world.
Right.
And why was it? What was it about Africans that almost made it seem as if they were the right subjects of slavery?
Right.
And we can we see a lot of that in the discourses of race, and when race came into the discourse of politics. The first term race was used earlier in the 15th century, and at the time it was mostly used to refer to ethnic groups. Nothing in terms of your skin color or your characteristics attached to your skin color. The first time that race now almost becomes politicized, in the sense that it was used to characterize people's skin color and the way they behave was a Swedish scholar, Linnaeus, who comes and starts categorizing people and attaching attributes to skin color. You know, the Mongoloids, the Caucasians, and saying, talking about like the Africans, and how they're darker skin, they are more aggressive, they're stronger. So from that discourse of race, conversations around the black man being stronger and more resilient in terms of hardship became a thing. And science, unfortunately, helped, imperialism a lot in the sense that when the idea of expanding and conquering other parts of the world, um, you know, uh, became the core policy in a lot of imperial countries at the time. Race became attached to politics. And then the idea slowly started to grow that, okay, if you had a plantation and you now had these Africans who were perceived to be stronger and much more resilient, then they're the best people to be used for such work. So yes, like, a lot of these started when race became part of politics and part of imperialism. And in order to legitimize imperialism and colonization, the African, as the lesser being and as the more resilient one in terms of working, became the scapegoat for
Mm,
such a trade. So this is just, it's a huge conversation, it's a large literature, but
absolutely.
this is it in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's the strength that became the weakness of the group. I mean, the
Mm,
African visible group now. It's the strength, like you said, the resilience of the people, and partly the aggression of the people, also that made the continent attractive to the slave traders at that time. But one of the things that is not often mentioned also in literature, or maybe it's not well documented,
mm,
is the fact that slave traders didn't just come into Africa and say, "Oh, everybody follow me, and here we go to Europe, and you're going to be working on plantations in the far ends of the earth." And then everybody just submitted themselves like fools. History often portrays slave trade like that, or
mhm,
it's people trying to run into the woods in Africa to escape from uh, the men who were sent to get slaves from that part of the world. But history does not actually say some things accurately, in the sense that, take for instance, I was watching this documentary that was released recently, Journey to an African Colony.
mhm,
By It was actually released by a Nigerian lawyer, a notable one. And one of the things he described in that documentary was the fact that Africa actually, or in this case, Nigeria specifically, put up a good fight against the slave masters. In fact, it was wars that broke loose. In fact, Africa had weapons before some of the colonizers, especially even the British, had some specific weapons.
mhm.
So they gave them a run until they were overpowered, and they were not overpowered until there was internal betrayal among the leadership of the time. I don't know if you would chime in on that. I'm not an expert in this.
I'm not an expert on it either, but there are lots of resources out there that that can really nuance the story of slave trade. So yes, like of course, like the Europeans didn't just show up on the continent and say match onto the boat and follow me. Um, there are research that has talked about the role of commerce in that, the role of missionaries, unfortunately, in the slave trade, um, and and then the fact that if you as a leader of a kingdom, for instance,
Right.
and we can look at, like, even the, Dahomey Empire, which was under Oyo Empire at some point. A lot of those decisions were made, um, not right, not ethical in terms of the fact that people were given away into slavery, but a lot of those decisions were made in order to protect kingdoms. And if you were the leader or the king who attempted to fight back, you know,
Hmm.
you could fight back and resist, but there were also accounts of people fighting back, or leaders, kings fighting back and losing their kingdoms, and having kingdoms being burnt to the ground and people taken away forcefully. So again, there were people who were complicit to the slave trade. But a lot of that complicity was as a result of the political dynamics and the relationship between them and the Europeans. It was either you fought, and in some cases, won fights. There were instances where, yeah, African
Right.
kingdoms fought. There was Asantiewa who fought the British when the officials came and tried to sit on the golden stool. So there are these
Right.
accounts of fights or wars happening to push back on European imperialism. But there are also stories of them fighting and losing, and then losing their people in the process. But let's not forget that there are also stories of kidnapping, that happened, and people, would be kidnapped while sleeping under the tree or something. And so slave trade happened. The acquiring of slaves happened in different ways, and I think we are yet to really show those nuances. Historians are trying to really present the different stories of slave trade, but we haven't done that effectively yet, and we need to take account
Right.
of all those forms of slave
Right.
trade.
Right. So one of the things that emerged post slave trade, I think specifically in the 1900s, early 1900s, was the the philosophy, or if you would say the Pan African ideology. I don't know if it's an ideology or a philosophy to call that, but you've written about that because I read that in some of your papers. Would you just briefly define what Pan Africanism is?
Okay, so in simple terms, I would say Pan-African or Pan-Africanism started as a movement. We know that it started in the U.S. By the Du Bois and the
Right.
Blytings, and the idea behind the movement was that there was a recognition that Black people across the world were experiencing the same oppression, and that the oppressor was the same. The European or the European colonizer in the case of Africa, and then the European or Spanish or French or British colonizer across the world. There was a recognition that we were going through an oppression, and that oppression was similar because of the color of our skin. So for that reason, it was necessary for you know Black people or Africans across the world to unite to fight this oppression. So we
Right.
would see an institutionalization of that movement starting from the 1900 Conference of Pan-Africanism, and that continued until 1945. The earlier movements from the 1900s had, Black Caribbeans and African Americans speaking about Pan Africanism and speaking about the need to band together to fight the oppressor. But it was the reason the 1945 Pan Africanists, the Manchester Conference, was very instrumental was because it brought in Africans. That's where you see Kwame Nkrumah coming in as a secretary in the conference, being mentored by Du Bois, and a whole other, African nationalist leaders across the continent.
Right.
So that was a realization that we need to expand this movement. We're all like Black people across the world going through the same experiences, and we need to fight the oppressor as a single unit. That is what Pan Africanism was all about.
All right, and just to be clear here, you mentioned a few things here. You talked about the fact that Pan Africanism actually did not even originate from the shores of Africa. It originated from the U.S. You said, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the heroes of Pan Africanism, you mentioned some of them. Du Bois was one, and Kwame Nkrumah was one on the shores of Africa in Ghana, and then you had other people like Malcolm X, actually, who's also a champion of that cause, right? But let's also put a clause here, because one of the things I see flying around, especially much more in modern time, is the fact that Pan Africanism is you see some self-proclaimed Pan-Africanists who call themselves people who reject the idea of Western education. I don't think that aligns perfectly with the idea of Pan-Africanism, does it?
Could you clarify further? So, a rejection of Western education in terms of like the forms of Western institutions and
Yes, exactly that.
okay. Okay, interesting. Yeah, like I find that really interesting. I haven't heard about this course, but no, that's not what Pan-Africanist movement is all about. Pan-Africanist movement, as it started, with the Pan-Africanists in the U.S. and then later on in collaboration with Africans and on the continent, was a recognition, and at the time, like they were fighting the end of slavery, and then oppression of African Americans in the U.S., and then realizing the need to also end colonization because they felt that the continuation of colonization would be the continuation of oppression of the black man everywhere else in the world, and that was why the movement expanded. So in the 20th century, it was mostly to end slavery and oppression through colonization. It would go further into the 60s to become something else within the continent of Africa. But the
Right.
focus at the time was what the continent was going through, which was the fact that it was still on the colonial rule of foreigners.
Right. So let's take this a little forward. Going stemming from Pan Africanism is the more organized institutions that were formed from the Pan African approach to problem solving for the African race. And
Mhm.
you've written extensively a little about it as well, about the African Union. The African Union is one major institution that was founded on that philosophy for the African race, right? If I pick on two-tier purpose that I actually picked from your paper, the first one is the quest for the African integration, and the second is to achieve complex domestic and international agendas. That was part of the document that was written for the formation of the African Union. I actually looked into the original document as well. I think there were 14 purposes that were defined when the institution was formed. It also evolved from OAU, right, Organization of African Unity, if I say that correctly. But chime in on this purpose and how Pan Africanism evolved into an organization like the African Union.
Okay. So, like I talked about, like, the Pan African movement, 20th century, all the way on to 1945, we start seeing the presence of, strong Pan African nationalists. And to point
Right.
it to those who are against Western education, a lot of them were educated outside of the
Absolutely.
continent. And sometimes, even when I teach, my students are like, okay, why is it that all the nationalists or, the Pan Africanists of Africa, almost every single one of them were educated in the West? Why is it that they were the one who led this movement? It's Kwame Nkrumah, it's America Cabral, it's the likes of Thomas Sankara, even the one that we don't want to hear about, Muammar Gaddafi.
Right.
So all these people had some form of interaction outside that they brought in and started this movement.
Mhm.
And I always say that when you become other and you interact with your so-called oppressor, or you're in the space where for the longest time you've been made to think that these people are way more superior, and you start to interact with them, and a lot of that interaction would make you realize one or the other. So it could either make you realize that, okay, maybe what they're saying is true, and they're the superior ones, and that is why they're ruling over us, and they have this upper hand because they're a lot more civilized and all. The other thing could be that you come to the realization that they're no better than you. They are equal to you. They are humans. You're as intelligent as they are. You are as analytical as they are. And I think that that is what really pushed these continental Pan-Africanism. That a lot of these people finally had a chance to be educated outside of the continent and engage with the so-called, the better or civilized, as
Hmm.
they had branded themselves to be, and realize that, oh no, they're no better than us. We are all the same. Actually, we've always been the same, but we've been, brainwashed into thinking that we are lesser beings. And then that really ignites a fire to really show the rest of the continent that we can take over power from these people, and we can rule ourselves. So we see Nkrumah come in 1945, becoming one of the secretaries to the Manchester Conference. And for Nkrumah, after several conversations in that conference, and really engaging the colonizers, from him, he was convinced that the right path towards freedom, and freedom from colonization, freedom from a possible neo-colonization, and he says this in his book Africa Must Unite, is
Right.
that we needed to band together as Africans and form a single African nation with a single currency, with a single military, with a single foreign policy. And, it was only when we united as, almost as he was pushing for an United States of Africa. And it was only when that happens is when we will be able to overcome colonization and overcome potential forms of new colonization. So we
Hmm.
would see him, collaborate with Sekou Toure and try to begin the little formations of a potential United States of Africa. And then we'll see the Ghana, Mali, Guinea Union, which didn't last long but broke away. And he'll bring in more other people. Abdel Nasser, they formed what we now know in the field as a Casablanca bloc. This is the
Right.
bloc that pushed for the United States of Africa. However, there were other members of the continent who felt like it was too aggressive to leave colonization, to become independent and give up sovereignty immediately to an entity. And they thought that instead of taking that radical approach, it would make more sense to do a bottom up integration where we start with
Okay.
economic integration and then slowly build up to political integration somewhere in the future.
Right.
Nigeria was part of those who would form the Monrovia group. There was a Brazzaville group, but it was mostly francophone. They wanted to retain ties with France, but these groups also agreed that a bottom-up approach was better for the continent. So as these two blocks were kind of like, negotiating on how should we unite, how should a Pan-African ideology be institutionalized, the compromise that was made was to create an organization that will now take that bottom-up approach. That organization became the Organization of African Unity in 1963. And the main agenda of the OAU was to, first of all, end colonization in all its forms on the continent. And that was what they focused on when it was created. And when that ended, with the end of apartheid in South Africa, there was a need to come back to the table and discuss how do we move forward from here. And this is when the new challenges that a continent faced led to the need to transform the organization from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. A whole, like, a,
Right.
so much goes into this, but this is it again in a nutshell.
Right. I'll just pick on one or two portions of the things you mentioned there. So, some an icon like Kwame Nkrumah has been thoroughly criticized by many, even though revered by many as well, for his wisdom and his plans for the continent, not just the continent, the race, actually. But one of the criticisms that he gets is that he wanted to govern Africa as a whole. And alongside such criticisms is what we see in the way someone like Francis Nyerere, the former president of Kenya, criticized the African Union as well, calling them, I think he called them a committee of tyrants or something like that, or a committee of dictators. Yeah, I think that was what he called them. And partly, I think he's right because it's the same set of leaders who have also facilitated different atrocities, including slavery in the past, who were forming this union. I will exclude people like Nkrumah and a few others there, but critics have mentioned this kind of factors in with respect to the formation of the OAU that led up to the AU as well. That narrative has not changed till date. It's still the same crop of people that we see in the AU right now. For instance, you're talking about the leadership in AU. You're talking about people like the president of Uganda, Museveni, who has been there since 1986, the year I was born. You're talking about the South African president. You're talking about Nigerian president, people who manipulate and doctor elections, who have set the stage for them to be perpetuated in power for such a long time. Like, when you put all of that side by side, the purpose of the AU in the way you described it, economic integration and then geopolitical integration, what is the hope for the
Oof.
AU?
What is the hope for the AU? Okay. So I'll start from the beginning when you talked about Kwame Nkrumah. He's usually regarded as the good African and a bad Ghanaian. And that was because he put a lot more emphasis on a united Africa. And a lot of Ghana's resources went into helping other African states during decolonization. They suffered economically for it. It affected Nkrumah's reputation along the way. But even in his speeches, and I remember one of the speeches, and whoever wants to look up can look up the All African People's Congress of 1958, and I think there's snippets of his speech on YouTube. He talked about when he talked about the United States of Africa. Yes, the rest of the leaders were afraid that because of the kind of his reputation, the fact that he was very much respected, the fact that he was one of the most powerful Pan-Africanists. Again, Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence that he was trying to lead. But in that speech, he also kind of like mentions clearly that, his dream was to have a United States of Africa with its capital, and because they were also afraid that
Ethiopia,
he was
right?
trying to locate the capital in Accra in Ghana. But he talked about,
Oh, right. Okay.
yeah, he talked about locating the capital centrally, maybe somewhere in, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was almost in the middle of the continent. So even when he spoke about it, it didn't seem, and this is my impression of him, I might be wrong, it didn't seem like he was trying to put Ghana, as the capital or the beacon of these United States of Africa. Um, he mostly wanted it to be, um, you know, maybe run by through an institution and locating the capital somewhere in the middle of the continent.
Right.
They didn't go into the details of if there'll be a president or a prime minister or whatever. So maybe the conversation would have been different. But the talk about location was to be in the middle of the continent. And yes, even in academia, a lot of political scientists usually use the phrase of the club of dictators, because, yeah, over the years, the continent has had several dictators. Some of them continue to attend OAU assemblies, without repercussions. Some of them ended up being chairpersons. Idi Amin used to be a chairperson of the OAU, so you
Right.
can think about,
Uh-huh.
these sorts of people being the chairperson, yet you know what was happening domestically. And my answer to that is that the the OAU became what the leaders wanted it to be. If it went in the direction that Nkrumah was talking about, the OAU would have been a very powerful institution. It would have been an institution with an authority to intervene in domestic issues.
Right.
But the organization was created exactly the way African leaders wanted it to be, a loose organization without much
Hmm.
authority. And that is why, when it was created, even as the OAU, the non interference norm and sovereignty was one of the strongest and most important pillars for them. So for them, it was important that the institution would not interfere in the domestic politics of member states. Understandably so, considering that a lot of these countries were coming out of colonization and just relinquishing sovereignty at the time was difficult. But that became one of the reasons the organization then and now continues to be weak. We do transform to a norm of non-indifference when,
Hmm.
after what happened in Rwanda, with the genocide,
Right.
the leaders came back to the drawing board and said, okay, we can't let that happen and just sit back and do nothing, because we were upholding the norm of non-interference. So they shifted to a norm of non-indifference, where in cases where there was a genocide or abuses, against human rights abuses, then the organization could intervene. But I believe the reason why, and we can talk about, this so many issues that the OAU has, you know, achieved. Like they haven't gone without achievements. They've had some successes, but there is much room for improvement. But I believe
Right.
that one of the reasons the organization is so weak is because it was created to be weak. That was how it was created, and it doesn't have much authority over domestic politics. It's done better over the years
Hmm.
to engage domestic politics, but it's not as authoritative as it should be. And that was
Okay.
what Nkrumah was envisioning.
Right. So let me read to you. Of course, you know this better because you wrote this. Because I picked this from your paper. So you mentioned in your paper the
Mhm.
successes of the African Union. The first one you mentioned there is that they've been able to build a common African position that is focused on global issues that include COVID-19, civil conflicts, and other developments within the African Union. And the second one is that they brought in their scope to promote cooperation and development. Now, the failure, the key one you talked about there, is the promise of regionalism is unfulfilled. And I think by that you're talking about um, the integration, in this
Mm.
case, in the position of strength within the African Union. Just before I actually ask you about this issue of integration, I think one of the things we should emphasize better is the integration of the Caribbean islands within the African Union. I may be biased about this, maybe because I married from that part of the world, but I think that has actually prompted me in recent times to study better about the West Indies generally and be able to understand the history. I think the documents also, even on Wikipedia, showed that uh, alongside the five blocks within the African Union, it's been suggested that the Caribbean islands should be integrated as a sixth block into the African Union. I think there will be a lot more economic benefit if that is done. What do you think about that?
So there is a sixth block in the African Union.
Is that
And the
right?
sixth block is African diaspora. And by African diaspora, it means every person, every group that identifies as African outside of the continent. So there is a sixth block. Like there is a five, regions within the continent, and then there is a sixth region, which is the African diaspora. And the organization, and this is one of the successes that I'll talk about, that I would stress is that they have strived. There are departments within the African Union that is created to engage diaspora. And this could be Africans living in the diaspora or Africans who are from the diaspora, who are from other countries. There's been some engagement, African scholars. I know that sometime, I believe it was 2008, if I'm correct, there was a time that, African scholars across the world were invited for a dialogue again on the whole issue of African integration. So they are part of the of the organization, but I think maybe there is room for improvement to promote this sixth region a lot more and have people know that there is actually a chance for you to contribute to building the continent as a result of being a member of the African Union.
Right, right. And just before I ask you about one of the suggestions you made in your op-ed, actually, when we talk about the African Union, I think there is a tendency that we could have to quickly dismiss it, especially when you talk about African Union to the Western nations. It's like, oh, those group of jokers, right? Or those dictators, committee of thugs, autocratic leaders. You can almost just, at the wave of your hand, just dismiss the entire idea. But when we talk about the African Union here, we're talking about it's not one country, it is 55 member states, right? Is that correct? 55 member
Yeah,
states.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And when we're talking about 55 member states, we're talking about 1.3 billion people that
Mhm,
especially has a young population. We're
mhm,
talking about a place of abundant human resources,
mhm,
abundant natural resources. 60% of world's arable land is found in that union. About 40% of minerals right now that will support the development of green energy that the world is talking about extensively right now is found within the same region. And you're talking about a country like Congo, for instance, that has about half of what the world needs for the manufacture of the lithium ion battery. They have the cobalt in that region. So you're talking about a lot of resources embedded within this region. So the issue with integration here, especially when we're talking about the way you described it, the bottom up approach, the economic integration within the continent, is actually It's something that ripples on the rest of the world. This is not an African race thing or an African thing. Would you agree with that?
Um, you mean the benefits of our
Absolutely. Yes, the
resources to the
benefits.
rest of the world? Yeah. Um, the rest of the world has built their economies on the back of African nations. And I'm glad you mentioned DRC, which again, you talked about things making it to the news, doesn't make it much to the news, but the struggles that they are going through are struggles that can be traced back to colonization, and the fact that certain leaders were empowered. This began with the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, and since then the country has been in chaos because the types of leaders that were in power were had to be supported by Western nations. So we can trace that all the way to colonization, and it continues to be a problem today. A country that's supposed to be one of the richest countries on the continent, but for some reason has been, it's pervaded with wars over its natural resources. So yeah, we tend to forget these people. So yes, the world has really built their economies on our backs, and I think that is why Kwame Nkrumah's plea in the 60s become even more important today. I sometimes when I read him, I feel like there was a premonition in his, in what he wrote and what he said. And you can see today that if we do not unite, we will continue to face forms of neocolonialism, and we can clearly see it in a lot of our politics today. So the world is benefiting from us, but we as Africans are not benefiting from our resources, and that's why we need
Right.
to strengthen our institutions. And when we talk about the African Union, because I do work with them closely, I do talk to people, bureaucrats of the African Union. I would want to also kind of like remind our audience that we might have 55 African
Member
leaders
state.
in the
Right.
assemblies, in the assembly that a lot of them have baggages, reputational issues. And we can talk about like, our president, the Cameroonian president, Ugandan president. A lot of them have, you know, a lot of baggage.
Hmm.
But these, although is made up of these questionable leaders, the institution is run by the most intelligent group of people that I've ever met. The bureaucrats who work in the different departments, be it in the Department of Peace and Political Affairs or in Economic and Social Development, like whatever they focus on AfTCA. These are like the brightest minds of Africa. And when I talk to them, that they know what's best for the continent, they know the solutions to the problem. But at the end of the day, the final decision makers is the assembly, which is made up of the heads of states and of governments.
Hmm.
So we have great minds thinking about how to integrate, coming up with protocols and proposals for further integration and economic development. But you need to match that with political will. Political will in the sense of leaders who are not thinking for themselves but are thinking for the benefit and welfare of their citizens,
Hmm.
to support that and pass that in the assembly. And I think that's one of the challenges that these bureaucrats are facing.
Right. I totally agree with you. So when you mention all these, now put it side by side, what you proposed in your op-ed, the proposal you gave there is a single document approach, and I want us to talk about that for a little bit. When I think about this a single document approach, the way I interpreted it when I read your work was that I think we have to ditch all this extensive bilateral agreements that we've signed over the years, and um, AU coming into a point that they're able to actually battle with world powers from a position of strength, and a document that represents the interest in this case. And by interest, we're not talking about political interest. We're talking about the possibility of an average African, an average Congolese, an average South African, Nigerian, a Kenyan who has sufficient economic strength to maintain their daily life and be able to project for a better future for them. That is my own interpretation for that. But I think that's at best a naive interpretation. So I will let you discuss that.
No, yeah, so some people might stone me, but again, um, that idea is not a novel idea. Um, is not novel because that is also what Kwame Nkrumah was preaching. He was preaching it in
Absolutely.
the context of a United States of Africa, but I think we're way past that. Forming a United States of Africa right now will be close to impossible, um, because we are so far along beyond the colonial era. There's a whole lot of like nationalist sentiments that will make that impossible. But how
Mhm.
can we leverage the institution that we already have to benefit the people? And by people, I don't mean the leaders, but the grassroots. And in that op-ed, I propose a single African Union foreign policy. Um, and that single African Union foreign policy would mean, like you said, instead of negotiating, Guinea-Bissau signing a bilateral agreement with the UK, or Senegal signing a bilateral agreement with the EU, why don't we have an African Union foreign policy that governs the way that we interact with all these regional organizations and states? We're already in the making. Like, so
Mhm.
I'm talking about a document that will support institutions that we already have. We have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement with its
Right.
headquarters in Accra. That is pushing for economic development, something that was talked about all the way in the 80s with the Lagos Plan of Action. But it took us several decades to create an institution to start implementing that. And it's still a struggle because there are a whole lot of things that need to be put in place nationally for economic, for goods and services to flow freely across the continent. So we have that. We have that institution. We have, a chairperson for it. Why don't we create an economic foreign policy that guides the way that institution interacts with the EU, with the US, with China? So it's no longer, because again, we need to think about small states, big states in the context of the African Union. Nigeria and South Africa, are the stronger economies on the continent, and they have a lot more, leverage when it comes to negotiating with the West. But smaller states, like Cape Verde, for instance, would have lesser negotiating power. So imagine, instead of leaving Cape Verde to go along and do its own bilateral agreements, why not do it through the
Bi-
AfCFTA with a
Right.
single foreign policy?
Absolutely.
And say the US, if you're going to do anything on the continent, you have to talk to the AfCFTA. And when they agree, then we can implement. So there needs to be a single foreign policy that guides the way we interact with the West. We have seen over the years that whenever we kind of like, and we've talked about the common African position and how, we have been able to push or project our voices in global spaces. The AU wrote the Esluwini Consensus, and it was a single voice
Mhm.
on how it was necessary to change the design of the United Nations Security Council, which still looks like a very colonial institution with the West being at the helms of power and having veto powers. So we have seen the power of speaking as one voice. Why don't we use it in the way that we interact with these nations on all spheres, um, of our foreign relations with them?
Right, right. I totally agree with you. Like when I think about an institution like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I hope I got the name
Mhm.
correctly. I, I think actually that might end up being, if not the biggest World Trade Organization, bigger than World Trade Organization. Um, I think it's a major strength that the AU has that they could actually leverage on that has not been leveraged well. But I think I'll probably bring you back another time when we're going to focus on this the economic benefit from the AFC FTA.
Yeah.
I think we'll be able to dive more into that. But let me pick on two more issues here. You've talked about the integration from the perspective of using a single document. And I think this the way you described it is accurate. It's like African nations or the African race, including the Caribbean islands, now sitting down from a position of strength and saying, America, this is what we want from you, and this is what you're going to get from us. Europe, you're going to get this from us, and this is what we want from you. But a lot of times, I think we're so disorganized. We go into organizations and institutions and even diplomatic relationships. We go there without purposes. In fact, I wonder sometimes what goes on in the minds of our diplomats when they show up in those meetings. Like, what is your bargaining strength that you're going with? Or it is whatever they say, we're just going to react to it. And I think that's the position we've taken for the most part. And I think if I use the words of Professor Lumumba, he said that has made Africa become a market, but not a factory.
Yeah.
It's just where everybody comes in, they grab what they want to grab, and they drop a little bit of money, and they use charitable donations and whatever, aids and whatever to support the nation, and they go away. That's how they picked from Africa. But now, one of the issues that the African Union is facing right now is immigration. There's a whole lot of that. I'm actually surprised. I didn't read that from all the readings I did recently about the sixth region that you mentioned, which are called Africans in diaspora. If I go back to the history of the development in India, for instance, India developed based off of immigration. India also had a brain drain period in which most of their graduates from their world class IIT institution began to move to the United States and Canada and some parts of Europe. But what you find is that people began to go back and begin to strengthen the economy, especially in tech right now in India. And I'm actually surprised that part of what is going on in East Africa, I'm saying many things together now, but I trust your judgment to be able to unpack all of these. Uh, IIT actually from India began to establish, or at least they're working on it to establish campuses. They're starting with Tanzania, and I think it's probably because of the historical bonds that India has with that part of the world in Tanzania and Kenya. It's another brand that in India is bringing now to Africa. And you also look at the relationships with BRICS, which I wouldn't let us go into BRICS today because I think that's a rabbit hole that will likely not come out of. China, India, Russia, they've become the neo-colonialists that Africa will be expecting to have in the next few years. In fact, I think that has started already. Go to Jamaica, for instance. Every time I go to Jamaica, the whole construction industry is taken over by the Chinese. Almost like their own people don't have any wherewithal to build anything for themselves anymore. The same thing goes for Ethiopia. Some of the resources were even going to be taken away from them because of the loans. And Africa comes from this position of, you know, weakness in that whenever you talk to the West is, oh, by the way, you're going to come to the IMF for loans very soon, and we may not grant you anything. And it's the reason we're kind of putting this fix, the fix of weakness. I don't know what you make of all these in the sense of how does the AU leverage on the power of the economic wherewithal that is in the hands of Africans in diaspora and be able to ensure some level of integration into Africa and also cause developmental changes there.
So, so on the topic of the diaspora, the AU has an organ or a department called the CEDO.
Okay.
I can't remember the full name now. Like my brain is all over the place, but like it has to do with also the diaspora involvement in the activities of the AU. But again, I think one of the challenges that it might be facing is promotion. So it needs to promote more to know that this organ is within the African Union. I know the last time I spoke to one of their heads, they had said they had a database on, different diaspora groups who were interested in contributing to the works of the African Union. So maybe they need to do a lot more work in terms of promoting to have a lot more diasporas involved in activities happening within the African Union. But yeah, like we hope that we are not going. Sure, we are not going to be experiencing the sort of colonization that we experienced, in the 18th century,
Hmm.
all up to the 20th century. We are not going to see it as that, but like the fear of Kwame Nkrumah is a form of neocolonization.
Correct.
Like you said, the China comes in and takes on a project, brings in its people, expects you to pay up, and if you don't, like there are repercussions that might include, wanting to take ports and all of that. Uh, those could be attributed to forms of neocolonization, and if heads of states are not um, you know, uh, kind of like focused on how to evade some of this situation, we might see ourselves being indirectly controlled by foreign nations once again. And again, this is why I say the African Union could be that institution uh, that really ensures that that doesn't happen. And I think the unique thing about our regional organizations on the continent is that we have the African Union as the umbrella, but we have 8 other regional economic communities that make up
Right.
sub-regions of the continent. We have the ECOWAS, we have the SADC, we have the IGAD, all of them.
Hmm.
And they're also doing work within their own regions, to push for economic cooperation and development. Let us leverage the institutions that we have. We have the African Peer Review Mechanism, which is actually the first monitoring institution on governance anywhere in the world. We need to leverage such, agencies. If APRM monitors a governance or election process and makes, recommendations, how seriously do heads of states take it? So back to your point about the role of negotiators and diplomats, like sometimes I feel like the challenge is not in the quality of negotiators that we have, because we have really smart people on the continent. What the problem we have is a political will. We lack that political will. We do not have leaders who are visionary. After the age of the Nkrumahs and the Abdel Nassers and the Patrice Lumumbas and the Secretures, all of them,
The
the
post
next
independent generation.
exactly the
Right.
next thing that was a little close to that, and we saw that during the transformation of the OAU to the AU, was, the Thabo Mbekis and the Obasanjos. They were the one who came up with, who started kind of like approving these ideas for, the NEPAD, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, the African Peer Review Mechanism. All these happened during their time when they talked about, you know, a need for an African Renaissance, a need for African solutions to African problems. But at this time, we've lost those crop of leaders. We
Hmm.
don't have them anymore. I don't know if we're going to have them in the future, or when they would come again, because it seems they come in, in clusters at specific times in life. But we would need those crop of visionary leaders who are really interested in transforming the continent and integrating the continent for the benefit of the people to make changes happen. We have the people, we have the minds, we have the bureaucrats who are well trained, who know their job, who knows what is right for the continent. But we are lacking the political will. And because the institutions that we have currently are not authoritative, it's going to continue to be a problem.
Let's begin to wrap up like this. When the war in Russia Ukraine broke out, and I know people will come after me and almost stone me, like you said earlier, about some of the strong opinions you gave there. When the war broke out there, as devastating and disastrous as that is, and I do not minimize the impact of wars on people's lives at all, but maybe my cynical mind told me something that an opportunity just opened here for Africa or for the African Union again. And why do I say that? Russia has a hold on oil, and Russia has a hold on agriculture to some extent. That is the supply of grains and fertilizers. Ukraine does as well. And as soon as that happened, we had this issue with grain being transported to a large part of the world, Africa especially. And let's not forget the fact that Africa has 60% of the world's arable land. But the excuses we've given is, oh, we need to now go back to Russia and talk to them. And then Russia invited our leaders to come. And then G20 decided to absorb African Union. And then that's what we are expecting that is going to solve the problem with grain for us. I thought in my mind, maybe I'm naive again, which I don't think I am, that I thought this is an opportunity for us to actually become a world producer of grain and find a way to actually be able to transport it to the rest of the world. That is how economics are built. In fact, data shows it that when you have economic downturns, people get rich from it. And I thought, oh, this is actually a chance for Africa to get rich here. But no, the narrative is the same. Now we have inflation in astronomical levels across Africa right now. It has destroyed the economy in Africa right now. I don't know what you think about that, especially with the whole interactions that is going on right now with Russia and Africa. I think Africa also, especially the leaders, have been forced to take sides. It's either you take the European American side or you take the Russian side, and it's either you're for us or you're our enemy. That's the way it's been told. But we had a chance for growth. We had a chance for development there. But I think we blew it. I don't know how you respond to that.
We've always had that chance. We have the bulk of natural resources that the world needs. But one of the problems that we have is that a lot of those resources we export them as primary resources, and we're not thinking about creating the facilities necessary to transform those primary resources. And by primary resources, like I'm thinking things like cocoa being transformed to chocolates. I know Ghana started its own kind of a chocolate factory. But there should be more of these ideas of, producing or or remanufacturing our own primary resources into final goods that now can be exported to other parts of the world. We're not leveraging that. Again, it boils down to why and who are the leaders in power, because it's not a question of not having the natural resources. It's not a question of not having the funds to do it. But yeah, we just don't have the right leaders. We have had that opportunity. I would even go as far as arguing since the existence of the continent, because the natural resources have
Right.
always been there, but we've never used it. Rather, we find that our leaders are happy to. Not that the G20 is not a good thing, because we live in a, the world is becoming a global village. It's becoming
Hmm.
globalized more and more, and international relations have become part and parcel of politics, and it will continue to be. So those relationships are important. Um, but we need to build from within and then go out. We know that we still have flaws when it comes to our own integration on the continent. I talked about the fact that, even moving goods within the continent is a problem. The question of a single African passport has been on the table for, how long now, and it's never been implemented and materialized. Imagine if, and I know that there are also some Africans who will be against it, but for me, like I'm the Pan African who would say, let's let go of the borders. Come on, people. In the first place, we did not create these borders. These borders were created by our colonizers,
Absolutely.
dividing a lot of ethnic groups, who were
Right.
supposed to be together. But now they find themselves in different, countries. These are not natural borders. These were created. Let's let go of them. And let's leverage, the continent for the benefit of everyone. Have a single passport. Make it easy for goods and services to move across the continent. There is a beautiful, graph, and I can't remember the organization that had it out, that to show, probably the African Union, to show how much trade happens between Africans and with Africans and the rest of the world. And it was so fascinating to see how much, we trade with other parts of the world and so little with our
With
neighbors.
ourselves. Right.
Yeah, on the continent. So, the more you observe is the more you're wondering, like, it's almost like a continuation of a divide, a rule.
Hmm.
The fact that we'd rather trade or, interact with outside than with ourselves. And that's why you see the continent, not progressing. We have leaders who have, refused to take these issues seriously, to develop their continents. We know the challenges that come with outside. We know that there are still, the sort of like unequal policies, when you look at, like, IMF, World Bank loans, what's happening in the World Trade Organizations. There's global inequality when it comes to our relationship with the West and with Western controlled international financial institutions. But we can
Hmm.
start from inside with the institutions that we have, that we've already put in place. So, what's stopping us? And the major
Right.
challenge there is that we have the wrong leaders.
Hmm. Right. There's a whole lot more that I could really bring up and we could chat about, but uh, we don't have the benefit of
Time.
endlessness in time. Yes. So we have to wrap it up on this note. I wish there were two more things I could talk to you about, but I'm going to bring you back another time. Hopefully, I didn't bore you too much on this conversation, and you will give me another opportunity to have you back here. One of them that I would have actually loved to follow up with you about is on the issue of protests. And I saw your paper that you wrote about that as well, because what happens when there is economic hardship
Yeah.
is the people will protest.
Mhm.
But our history in Africa is really awful about protest. And I've read a little bit about that. And I hate to say that a lot of times we function like dictators, or
Mhm.
in its best form where our leaders are autocratic in their disposition towards the people.
Mhm.
And I'm not surprised because many of those tendencies were actually left in place by the colonialists. In fact,
Mhm.
our first reference that I know in the 1900s to protest is the ABBA Women's Riot
Yep.
that ended up
1929.
in 1929 that ended up in
Yep.
the massacre of several women.
Yep.
And then you have the other protest of 1947, the Abeokuta women's
Mhm.
revolt as well. It was the imperialists of the time who actually unleashed the police on the people. Until
Mhm.
date, that's the template that we're running with. In
Mhm.
Nigeria, in the rest of Africa, I think the exception will be in places like in the Caribbean island. Not too much as well, but they have that exception. But I think I would rather bring you back so we can talk about this. And I hate to say that this issue is going to be relevant very soon again because we're going to have another protest coming in the shores of Africa. I don't know which country is going to come from. Another coup, maybe. But
Uh, we're still dealing with the current coups. So
right, right.
yeah.
So I will let you give a few seconds for your final thoughts. What should the average African mind across the world be thinking about from this conversation? Just in a few
Okay.
seconds.
Because to end the conversation, yeah, like we'd have to come back for it because if I start on the protest, we're going to go on for another hour. But just to the Africans around the world, I would say, and I'm one of those because I'm Nigerian who is currently not living in Nigeria. Um, and you know, we need to. We know that there are so much hardships, and a lot of us were forced to leave and remain outside because there was nothing to hold on to back home. Um, so I would say, don't forget your Africanness. For me, my mission in life has been that wherever I am and whatever I'm doing, how am I giving back? I'm currently an academic, teaching. So how am I giving back through my teaching? How am I, contributing to the discourse through my research? And I hope that we can all think about that. And I know that there are little pockets of conversations, and I think it's a continuation of this divide and rule. So we really need to decolonize our minds. I was on a podcast where there was a banter between Afro Caribbeans and Africans and African Americans, and I'm like, about like how we hate each other and what we hate about each other.
Hmm.
These are the conversations that don't unite us, that don't help us, that would actually,
Right,
benefit neo-colonial powers,
right,
because the more we are divided, the more we can be exploited, and the more you know, kind of like stagnant will remain. So I would hope that we somehow, as a group, um, move beyond those colonial mindsets of how we are different and how we're not, and focus on how we can grow as a group of
group,
people,
right,
ensuring the growth and benefit of the continent for all. So strive
right.
to be the African who gives back.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. And I'll keep that in mind as well, because I belong in that group as well.
Yes, you should.
Right. So,
Speaking to
well,
you as well.
thank you. Right, right. I appreciate that. So, thank you very much, Dr. Rolo, for joining me today. And
Thank
to
you.
everyone who's watching and listening to this after now, thank you very much also for your time and your attention. That is not taken for granted at all. And don't forget to show some support to the work that has been done on the channel as well. Follow, like, and subscribe to the channel as well. And Dr. Rolo, I will look forward to chatting with you again very soon.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasant conversation.